we've decided to start this year by just reflecting on the last 12 months of our advocacy and our work and the bigger context of where we're going. So welcome, everyone. Before I start, it's really important we just do all take a moment to acknowledge that we are all on unceded lands of First Nations people. I'm actually today on Ngunnawal country in the ACT and what is also known as Canberra, and I want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of these lands and also from the lands that you're coming from today. You may want to use the chat to just put a little acknowledgement and let everyone else know the lands that you're coming from today. Thanks so much, Danny, for your sharing as well. Before we go on, there's probably a few people here today who are not too familiar with what WAVE is and what we do and what we stand for. So we just might open with just a little bit of an overview. Look, WAVE really is here to advocate that our national vocational education and training system is equitable for all women and girls, and that's all women and girls with all the compounding and intersectional barriers that they face to be a part of our education and training system and thrive. And our vision and what we want to see is a future where women and girls can participate fully in all aspects of work in democratic society because of a transformative education and training system. The way that we work, well, we really work to sort of 4 key principles. And any of you that work for women's organisations or in feminist or social work, social collaborative work will recognise these. We are absolutely a feminist organisation, an intersectional feminist organisation, and we see the world through this prism, and it informs and is the bedrock of how we behave. And in all things, we like to make sure that we're centering the lived experience. And you'll probably hear that start to come out in some of the work that we're doing and some of the activities that we're trying to advocate for. We profoundly understand, believe, and trust and learn from the evidence that tells us that at the end of the day, education is transformative. And with all good things that happen in this world, we can only do what we do if we act in collaboration and in partnership. And one of those is today. So thank you so much to everyone being online. This webinar is mainly going to be a sharing of slides and of information, but if you do want to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so through the chat function, which will be at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. We're going to run this session today till about 1:30. No longer, because everyone's lunch hour is very precious. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. But what are we going to do? Well, we're going to start by looking about what the big picture is. What's the context of where we are at now? And what are the implications and how can we see that be revealed through the last 12 months of program of policy reform in Australia's adult and education system, but particularly from WAVE's perspectives? We're going to give you a bit of a headline about what the key priorities and work of WAVE is, and I guess invite you to join us on the next stages of that journey. If you do have anything else that you would like us to touch on, please absolutely do send us in a question on the chat, and we'll try to make sure, or we'll make sure that we incorporate that as we go. So without much further ado, what is our bigger picture? Well, you know, in true WAVE style, let's look at the lived experience of women in our world. The lived experience of women in our world, which was shared most recently on International Women's Day, when the Australian government launched Working for Women Gender Equality Strategy. They also released what was called the 2024 Status of Women Report Card. And this is publicly available on the Office for Women Federal Government's website. But you can see there that there are some very telling statistics that, crudely, the work is not over. We have a diverse and hardworking group of women across Australia, but the persistence of gender stereotypes and attitudes is ongoing and all pervasive. Many of us on this line know that results in the horrendous crisis of gender-based violence in the home and in the workplace. and of inequitable outcomes for women, their health and well-being. Skills and education tends to sit in the economic equity space, but the way that WAVE tends to look at it more and more is education is emancipatory for all aspects of a person's life. But if we do look at that economic equality and security, WGE has released the pay gap data. There is not one industry where there is not a pay gap, and that's persistent. And of course, the ongoing work of women carrying the burden of care and how this permeates through all aspects of the work that occurs. So that is kind of the bigger picture if we think about the lived experience of women. And I just want to recognise that if you're a woman with an experience of being a migrant, experience of having a disability, if you're a woman who's a single mum, who's living in poverty, a combination of any of those or other intersectional forms of disadvantage, these realities, these problems in your life, these challenges are compounded. They are compounded. And we just need to recognise that when we think about them. And we hold that pretty close at WAVE. So what is the big picture when it comes to those policies? Well, if WAVE looks back since the start of this government, there is no way of getting around it. But we saw a lot of momentum and change occur with the election of the current federal government. And if you look in the ALP platform, there it is, in the national platform, the need to create a gender equal society. And look, I don't mind what side of the fence you sit on, but there's no getting around it that the drive for change requires leadership and strong, clear intent of that leadership. And I think we've got an example of it here. But then after the current government was elected, we saw very quickly a set of actions, and there's a few here which we think is the highlights that really started to drive the change for equity and equality in vocational education and training and skills. The first one was the establishment of the new advisory structure reform, and started with the legislation created by Jobs and Skills Australia, which really encoded what we think of as encoded the need for gender equality and its drivers, and also the Jobs and Skills Councils, who are very much cognizant of the need and the value of what they are calling diverse workforces. National Skills Agreement, the National Skills Agreement, she says, was also a key moment of change. And for the first time, we saw in that agreement across the jurisdictions, the centering of gender equality principles. Finally, most recently, the Accord. I mean, the Accord, it was, Reese is called the Universities Accord, but it's got very strong implications for all of Australian education, particularly post-schooling. It talked about improving equity for cohorts, for specific cohorts, but really centred the need for improving student wellbeing, especially women. But let's take another look about vet and equity policy change from the point of view of women's policy, from the point of view of gender policy. Again, it starts with that clear political will and leadership. No getting around it, that's a reality. But we saw very quickly what happened was the introduction from the Office of Women of a piece of policy called gender responsive budgeting. And the resources popped up on their website for the 24-25 budget for all submissions that were cabinet-based and what they call national agreements, for want of a better term. We then have also got WEAT, which is the shorthand for the Women's Equity Economic Task Force, which made these 7 recommendations to address barriers that women face in the economy. And they accounted for some $128 billion of return value if those are realised over the next 10 years. And then also, most recently, around International Women's Day, the Australian government launched Working for Women strategy, which absolutely names in it, in the chapter and priorities around economic equity, the need for participation, also equitable participation in education and training. But let's just do a little bit of a focus. So the WEET, the 10-year plan, their recommendation for names the barriers around equitable participation in education and training for all women, that if the Australian government must provide women in Australia with lifelong, accessible and flexible, affordable education and skills building. There it is in black and white. They also must remove existing disincentives and inequities that perpetuate industry and occupational segregation and the sustained pay and wealth gaps. Now, waive the segregation that we see in our workforce, we know is reflected in our education and training system. And we see absolutely, and the evidence is there, that one feeds the other. And we've recently heard from, the Accord about some of those disincentives that often are faced by women in the education and training sector. Feminised industries, they tend to pay more, don't they, for their on-job learning, for their so-called workplace experience than male-dominated learning pathways. And also, if we think about the care burden, the decisions that women make to do education and training, there is absolutely a higher cost imperative in decision making. So the WEET absolutely centres this reality. The other group, of course, the other piece that centres this that we referred to ago was the National Skills Plan. And principle 3 of that agreement, I should say, absolutely says that in all Australians, and particularly women, and First Nations Australians, young people, mature age Australians, and those experiencing long-term unemployment, people from culturally and linguistically diverse or marginalised communities, people with a disability and regional and remote learners have access to education, training and support needed to obtain well-paid, secure jobs. So there's absolutely that link between those that experience disadvantage, those that have got additional barriers to them, and how the education system needs to think through that in order to deliver the vision, the mission, the call to action for Australia's vocational and education and training system, which is well-paid, secure jobs. Finally, the organisation called Jobs and Skills Australia in their roadmap talk about, we need to understand more about those barriers that lead to gendered outcomes in the pathways. So you can sort of see how these are starting to link together. And one of the statements in this roadmap that I thought was amazing, blew me away, I celebrated, was this following statement. Pathways and occupations, industries and workplaces, from gendered norms, perceptions and cultures to access and participation. I don't think I'd ever seen in a piece of education policy, at least in my memory, those words, the idea that there are stereotypes that drive gendered outcomes as well. So that was very powerful. And finally, working for women, the strategy names in economic area, priority 3, economic equality and security, that there needs to be a sustained reduction in the gender pay gap and retirement incomes, and links that to equitable access to education and skills systems and removing disincentives. So across all of those key policy areas, you can see the Australian government in these major archetype sort of frameworks starting to link together the reality of gendered natures of education and skilling and the outcomes that they deliver. But folks, let's not forget some other little bits that have come through that have, I think really continue to send the signal about changes are coming. The release of the WGEA data for individual employers' pay gap was a moment, wasn't it? It was a moment. It was a really powerful indicator of how important transparent, segregated data is to describing the reality of our world, right? And long may it contain. So that was a transformative moment. Positive duty, the requirement that organisations take action to stop discrimination, was another forward-moving moment. We had very recently, and Wave made a comment in it, I made a comment in it in the TAFE Directors Australian newsletter about the incredibly powerful moment of the Fair Work value case for aged care that actually recognised and named these benchmarks that we use over time to calibrate what makes a skill valuable and what doesn't. I highly recommend, if you have time, to read that decision, because what it names is that there is an undervaluation on the basis of gender, of work. And finally, our OH&S laws across the country are mandating action being taken around gender-based violence. So that's kind of the bigger picture, the state of women, remembering there is intersectional barriers, and also some of those massive pieces of policy change and strategy that are emerging. And, we're a couple of years in and we're starting to see them trickle down. I mean, even today, the launch and the release of the membership of Jobs and Skills Australia Ministerial Advisory Board, I think there are some of us who were very excited to see. Well, I was, because she's from Springvale in my local haunt, now Adult, who will be able to absolutely bring that lived experience of migrant women to the table. So across the 2 years, what has been that program of reform? We've looked at the bigger pictures. Well, I think from Wave's perspective, we can kind of see some key themes coming through when it comes to the way that the reform is occurring in post-secondary adult education, if I can say that. Firstly, there's this juggernaut of energy transformation. Lots of discussions about clean energy future and the clean energy industry and how we can transform the workforce to change the way the nation powers itself. The states and the national jurisdictions are really looking into that quite deeply. There is the ongoing discussion about apprentices, including trainees, and how we encourage participation, but just that ongoing reality of improving completion rates. Planning and data. I think with the rise of JSA and the JSEs, this space is going to get more and more intense. And certainly in Wave's dealings with the federal government, they're very much alive to the fact that we can, really better with our data to better understand, not only to better understand what's already there, but to also have conversations about what we're not measuring and what that means. Of course, there is also a discussion, and a welcome discussion, we think, about focusing on the vet workforce itself. When we think about the vet workforce and the vet workforce blueprint submissions, I think closed yesterday, this idea about, oh, hang on, we have got a shortage of teachers. Well, for Wave, there is a gender lens to put over that, about that might be the case. Might be the case. Again, I've probably said it a few times, but the rise of the conversation about gender segregation and what we call gender atypical sectors. I think the moment that Jobs and Skills Australia released a document, a piece of research that linked highly gender atypical sectors with skill shortages, was a moment of movement in this space. And then I think the other area that probably has emerged and is not complete, there's a lot of work and a lot of water to go under the bridge here, was overseas skilling, improving skilled migration and international education. And the government are very alive to some of the gendered realities in that conversation. One of the first consultations that I went to with the federal government under the new regime, or the new leadership, the second slide after the title slide was a gender disaggregation of data of those that apply for and received skilled migrant visas. That was pretty momentous. While we've got these themes, I think, just to headline, these are some of the submissions that Wave has made over the last 12 to 18 months. You can see their foundation skills is also part of it, which I know Minister O'Connor is very alive to. We had the employment white paper, input into legislation. Of course, you've got the piloting underway at the moment of RTO standards that actually are clear, very clear about the obligations of RTOs for student wellbeing and to ensure and prevent sexual harassment, not only in student learning environments, but also in the workplaces for their staff. Wave have also done a pre-budget submission as well. All of these are absolutely on the Wave website, but it just gives you an indication that across all of those submissions and work and hearings that we've engaged with, you know, they're all, to us, there does seem to be those common themes. Danny, I can see your comment. Thank you so much. Danny said, is the need for long placements without payments for students linked to any of these themes, Kit? Yeah, great question. Look, invite anyone online to maybe respond to Danny. So our view, and it's one that we've put forward with the Equality Rights Alliance as well, is that what we've noticed is that that is a gender issue, because typically pathways that encounter, that are feminised, often have unpaid long work placements. Yeah, often have unpaid long work placements. Or if they don't, the units of competence, yeah, thanks, Lynette, social workers, community development workers, or those that know vet qualifications, you'll also know those sometimes 500 hours. And Lynette, aren't they in units of competence in the training package? Oh, you must also have 500 hours of work placement, but it's often unfunded. Equality Rights Alliance observation, which we back and support, is often that. Yeah, outrageous. I agree. Is that it's unfunded often. But if we think about male-dominated learning pathways, right, often the on-the-job learning is funded. Yeah, and encourage anyone to have a look at that in their own time. Yeah, there was an interesting piece of research. I think I've got Elaine Butler on the line here, but I think Elaine, it came from the University of Melbourne, that actually looked at that over time, what's actually happened is that women actually bear a higher cost for their education, especially in student loans as well, and that debt as well. So, Danny, absolutely, we would say. And I guess, you know, woven back into the number of submissions, I think the Accord has absolutely lifted that as well. Great question. Thank you for that. So just let's move on to, and I've probably alluded to it, what those key priorities have been. Across all submissions, the engagement, the meetings, what do we find ourselves saying again and again? Well, at a high level again, let's start at the big picture. It's really coming down to four things. And those that have worked in intersectional practice and equity for some time, you might recognise these from just kind of gender mainstreaming, intersectional practice globally, you know. Centre the lived experience in decisions, in co-design, in programming, in evaluation, whatever. Centre the lived experience. And often what we'll find ourselves talking about is sitting in a room with, frankly, people that sound and look like me, probably more male than me, making decisions about education and training for people's future when we don't have those people in the room. Yeah. So centering lived experiences are vital. The other thing that we talk about is segregate the data. Start to pull it out the different journeys. So recently we know that the NCVR released the latest 2023 apprenticeship data, and the headlines of that, great news, talked about 93% completions. Now, if you drill into Vox stats, right, and you look at that 23 data, just with a very simple gendered lens, that story is not consistent, right? That story is gendered, right? So let's start having data shared in a way that describes that there are different journeys and there are barriers for different people depending on their lived experience. We really need to move our practice not from ignoring, not being gender blind, not even being gender neutral, but to actually creating transformative change, like actually making policy and practice in a way that makes the world a better place. Now, in my heart of hearts, I actually know the good educators out there, and there are many, many of them, that's actually what they want to do. That's why they're in the game. So let's empower the systems and structures around them so that that can happen. Let's move to transformational equity in that. And finally, can we just respect the system and build the capacity and capability of the people in it so it can be done sustainably? So if you come and you sit in a meeting with WAVE, you come and you look at a submission, the chances are we're talking about somewhere linked to those four things, right? But more specifically, these are kind of what our recommendations for too. You know, when we talk about transforming education and training in Australia, we're asking for an education system that is not one size fits all, with special attention to the reality, to the complete lived experience, to the complete social determinants, to the fact there is a care burden, to the fact there is a pay gap, to the fact that there is a thing called sexual harassment or workplace gendered violence, to the fact there is, you know, there is a thing called, you know, single parenthood and those sort of things like that, to the fact that women's work is underpaid. Can we just think about that when we do it? And at a heart of hearts, we stand on the shoulders of giants of this from generations. Let's make equity a founding block, a keystone of our education and training system. Now, if you think about that, that's a little bit of a challenging statement because we often talk about an industry-driven training system. We're not saying that needs to change, but let's put equity at the base of our decision-making in what we do. You know, acknowledging the barriers that people face and improve education and training practices so that we're actually building capacity up to them. Centred lived experience I've referred to before, but that's vital. What we know, even from global work, from climate change work, from CSW that's just finished, is that if you don't have the lived experience and the decision-making at the table, the decisions are poor for it, right? We also are calling out the fact that when we think of funding, the capital investment in VET is inequitable, right? And it's inequitable based on a whole lot of assumptions and benchmarks that have implicitly over time codified discrimination, systemic discrimination, codified attitudes, and the assumptions, gendered assumptions. So we actually need to do a lot better at identifying those and responding to it from a budgeting perspective, aligned with this, you know, and in line with the policy that was released from the Office of Women. Let's do gender impact assessments on our policy and our funding and our programs. And finally, redefine, you know, what we mean by our skilling system, that it's also about civic and social life as well, and the health and well-being of people. So, you know, we've got those four ideas, but they do at a detailed level in some way also translate into these manifesto key points, I guess you'd say, for what WAVE wants to see. Just looking at the chat before I go on to the next session, and Elaine, hi Elaine, has talked about, is it still the case that apprentices get support for their tools? Yes, it is, Elaine. And Danny's had a reply. Yeah, Danny, I'm really liking the way that you're distinguishing the idea of placement versus work. Yeah, I really like that. I've never thought of that before, so thank you. Yeah, and I think the evidence absolutely is, Elaine, that, you know, if you're doing community services and you've got a placement and you're doing other feminising that's not trade, then you're not getting that payment. Now, people often go, but what about beauty and hairdressing? But that's not the main game or the main thing. So where to next? For those listening on the line, where to next? Well, really, there's a set of call to actions that we think we can all ask, that we invite you to all join in with. And there are call to actions which are about responding to some challenges based on that clear intent, the evidence, and now taking action. So the first practical one is the fact that what we call, or what I call, the vet canon. So that's the kind of the body of evidence and the data and the research and everything that is that vet and adult education and training often bases their world on, sort of stops at equity. It sort of gets to the end of it, goes, oh, look, there is a problem. Look at that. There's a problem in completion rates. Or look at that. There's a problem there with not enough apprentices. Or oh, look at that. Right? But you can actually find a solution by embracing and looking towards other bodies of knowledge. And what WAVE says, look towards the policy, practice, and evidence of gender equality to solve the challenges that you're currently facing. It's there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can just embrace it and learn from it. So that's the first call to action. The second call to action, and we realise that some of these are quite challenging, is that we know that from the new reform structures that we've got, is that the system is starting to understand and learn that, oh, yeah, there is a bit of a problem. Yeah, we might need to do something about that, about inequity and intersectional barriers, but we're not sure what to do. So that's one of the things that we're immediately seeing. Well, the solution is Australia and the globe over do this in a whole range of other industries and sectors and communities. Build sustainable capability and capacity in the system. Don't go out and hire another consultant, because there's them. Build it within the system. Sustain it, support it, coach it, mentoring it to be sustainable. And that's the way we're going to get the outcomes, and partner with the expertise, with the people that are doing the work, because that's actually how you get it. And that concept of partnering with the expertise is something that's used and respected the world over in so many sectors. The other thing that we've noticed, and the other call to action, is that the whole conversations about equity, equality and skills policy are not coordinated. They seem to be happening in different parts of the department or different parts of the system. What we know is it's so much better in this work if there is a coordinated, agreed set of change principles, practices and goals, right? So the solution is to generate momentum, make the best of the slim resources we've got by coordinating the effort. And with the capability building, you can see it then flow through. I think the other thing too is just this ongoing piece about, that we need to actually challenge ourselves about if we're still listening to the same voices. If we're still seeing the same challenges after decade, is it because we're not delivering ourselves new information or considering new concepts or trying new things, but just same with the sort of same of what we've done before? So we need to address persistent inequity, because it is persistent, and the segregation that's prevalent in adult education and training and post-secondary schooling. By bringing the lived experience of solving this and who's being impacted by it into the room where those decisions are made. Just looking right. Oh, yes. Elaine's just gone. Oh, my gosh, you're right. Yes, unfortunately, it's sad face, isn't it? So to those on the line, what can you do? We know there is value in consistent and persistent collective action, to quote the head of Women in Super. So I guess we invite you all today to sort of think about what these call to actions and what these messages might mean for you, and if there's something that you can align with, and perhaps share them to the people that you're part of. For those of us that work in wellbeing and health and social determinants, economic equity and the education and training that we get access to lift that is a key part of it. So What messages could you perhaps send? And we also know that we need to, like all good work, raise more voices about addressing inequity in more parts of VET, or the adult education and training system. Now, WAVE at the moment is the only organisation that we found that centres on this mission for this sector. And we're finding ourselves in more and more rooms and places, which is fantastic. But it'd be great if there were more people available and more voices doing that as well. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Danny. So, look, just in closing, I know it's, a few minutes before the 1:30 we were going to end, but, if there's any questions or comments or any reflections, just invite yourself to stick your hand up or take yourself on mute before we close up today, to provide, any insights as to what we've shared today, and any thoughts about the WAVE future. This is just a set of thoughts about where WAVE is at the moment, but there may, of course, be many more. And just while I'm waiting for someone to perhaps stick their hand up or make a comment or put something in the chat, we also invite you to join WAVE, which you can do via our website as well. You join up and be part and support the organisation from change as we progress forward. I think, though, what I might do is bring this webinar to a close. I'm very much in favour of giving busy people the gift of time, and it is a gift when you have it. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, for being present today, for also sharing your lunch hour with us. If you do have any questions, please feel absolutely free to email any of the WAVE team at just wave@wave.org.au, or reach out to us via our LinkedIn page, which is often the site where we post a lot of our information and alerts. Thanks, everyone. You have a marvellous and wonderful day. Thanks for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all again in time. Bye.